Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and we got a new episode of The Trailing Edge for February 2018, where I take a look at a bunch of records that wound up on my schedule for this month, for which I just did not have enough material for a full review. Got 10 on the docket today, so let's start off with The Time Is Now by Craig David. Falling together, arms around each other. I know you know me too. We're all stumbling through the night, but it's paradise in our minds. Alright, look, Craig David, he had his breakthrough hits in the early 2000s that I remember as being pretty damn solid, and revisiting them for this confirmed he definitely had his place in modern, mainstream, pop-leaning R&B, adapting many of the modern dance tones of the 2000s in the vein of someone like Usher, with the smooth classiness of an act like Neo. But by 2010, his career had stalled out hard, and while he tried to regain traction with a record in 2016, this was reportedly the album that put him back in the mainstream, and man alive, it is an awkward shift, seemingly gutting so many of Craig David's strengths as an R&B singer in favor of clunky tropical trap and grime production with quality that is all over the map. None of this is helped by the pile-on of auto-tune onto Craig David's vocals, which only further serves to weaken the smooth, sensual delivery that used to be his hallmark. And what's so heartbreaking is that you can tell he's trying so damn hard to sell it, and when you couple it with lyrics that seem to be paradoxically trying way too hard or not trying at all, both in pop, R&B, and grime, you've got a record that just feels like a flimsy attempt to re-grab the spotlight, sound current and relevant, and yet only further dates itself along the way. Thinking a light 4 out of 10. Next up, Divine Intervention by Mind Over Matter. My purity becomes such a hassle, but I don't want to get stuck in the black hole. Isolate myself in a castle, built out of all the fears that I have most, weighed down by these moral tobaccos. I don't want to stay stuck in the black hole. Okay, I'm gonna try and be as nice as I possibly can with this, given that the patron that requested it is the MC that made it, and he's also pretty young and still figuring out his lane and sound. Even though if you're looking for a subgenre that's about the last thing I would otherwise look to cover, Christian-leaning hip-hop and acoustic emo, that would fit the bill. But to his credit, it's not like some of the more developed synthleys and grooves that they aren't passable, and I'll give him some credit for at least trying to tackle some bigger subjects and concept, like the parable of the Good Samaritan, or the juxtaposition between Cain and Abel amidst a more modernist setting. But for as well as so many of his flows might be structured and rhyme pretty well, nearly all the vocals are layered too quietly in the mix or not given significant presence with multi-tracking or overdubs, which you need as a rapper if you're not naturally expressive, and that's not even touching on the singing, which is when it's not painfully flat, off-key, or forced, it just cannot convey significant emotive presence, and there's a lot more singing on this record than I expected. And that's before we get to the content, which unfortunately falls in the rut too much Christian music does in terms of its self-flagellation, but then using it as a conduit and an excuse for both anti-porn and anti-marijuana sentiments that feel lacking in dimension and thought, not helped by a misunderstanding of the focus in parables like the Good Samaritan. What gives the story its power is how the Samaritan did step up as the neighbor in preaching tolerance for all, not just assuming that he wouldn't stop and then placing the blame on the victim for dying and giving up. It's actually a little bit alarming how much of a depressed, nihilistic streak runs through the overplayed relationship drama of Love of My Life, or the conversation with God on Carcinogen, or how the album just cannot accept that feeling good for doing good things isn't a bad thing and not an inherent focal point of pride. It's not like there's any implications that the protagonist here is only doing good for attention, like the parable between the Pharisee and the tax collector in the temple. Yeah, I can make Bible references too here, man. As a whole, look, I'm loath to come down too hard on this because it's clear his heart's in the right place. He's just starting out, and he did make a significant effort, but between the bad singing, the weak vocal layering, and the questionable content, I did not enjoy this much at all. Also, if you're gonna bring in electric guitars as he does on near the end of the album, give them some muscle or firepower, and then ensure you can at least somewhat come close to matching them in the vocals. I'm thinking maybe a strong 4 out of 10. Next up, Keys and Krates with their album Cura.
It's like clockwork, reflection, glimmer, shine like glitter, glitter. It's like clockwork, reflection, glimmer. Ooh.
Okay, so now we've got a Canadian electronic drum and bass group with this new EP, and you know, for as many random drum and bass shows that I wander into, and yes, it's become a bit of annoyance for me in the past few months, it's been almost accidental, you would think I've come to like the genre a little bit more, but the more I tried to dig into this particular group's vocal sample palette over trap beats without a lot of texture or impact, the less I was all that impressed, especially given their samples trended towards increasingly shrill, trendy, pitch-shifted shouts, and I wish I could say this new EP was a change of pace, but between a mix without a lot of texture, these ugly, glassy films over many of the atonal samples, entirely too many chipmunk vocals, unimpressive guest performances, and overweight trap beats, even despite a few pretty fragments and tolerable grooves, I'm sorry, not enough to salvage this. I did not enjoy it. Light 4 out of 10. Next up, Amen by Young Rhye.
So right, they say I get better as the days go by. I just try to be the go. Used to see them walk by. You ain't ready for this life. All I see is red and white.
Okay, look, I had a hard time thinking I could dedicate a full review to an artist who on some level is a glorified meme, who blew up off of a song called Dat Stick 2 years ago, spent time working with other members of the SoundCloud rap crew, and beyond a pretty solid baritone in his delivery and a naming controversy, hasn't really proven all that compelling outside of that niche. And yet, I've had some difficulty defining what that niche even is and on what level of ironic detachment I'm supposed to appreciate this. So when his record showed up on my schedule, I figured I might as well talk about it, and honestly, it's not that bad. I can appreciate that young Brian aimed to take things a little bit more seriously this time around, and a little bit less of a meme. And he's got a knack for unconventional synth loops that counterbalances deeper baritone pretty nicely. The problem is that without the larger joke and the meme of his content, he winds up defaulting to a lot of trap flexing that might flow kind of alright, but feels increasingly interchangeable from track to track. Honestly, I might actually prefer this guy as a producer more than an MC. His melodic instincts are certainly better than all the rhymes he flubs, or the stories that rapidly start running together with very little interesting or flattering detail. But you know what? In comparison with most of his guests here who are not bringing their best, I'd probably prefer Rich Brian overall, so yeah, it's barely passable. Strong 5 out of 10. Next up, Blood by Rhye.
I'll count to 5.
Oh, I was planning on giving this a full review, most notably because I was late to the punch when I covered Rhye 5 years ago and I didn't want to make that mistake twice, but even minus founding member Robin Hannibal, I found myself less and less to say with every listen through Blood, most because of the issues I found with Woman haven't really gone away, the majority of it tying into compositional and production cohesion. Melash's voice is silky smooth in the best possible way, and plays really well to quiet storms seething in a lot of the grooves and tones, but when the instrumentation plays to more overstated broad textures that it cannot match the vocal fidelity, it can lead to blending that's more awkwardly disjointed than intriguingly mismatched. I did kind of dig the greater emphasis on groove overall, even if I'm not really convinced Malash is riding those grooves all that well, and there are definitely tunes here that would be on par with a mid to low tier song from the XX, but then we get to the lyrics, which can feel very awkwardly basic and lacking the level of elegance or poetry you would hope to get for delivery and grooves that are at least trying to be a little more tasteful. Hell, at some points the lyrics can feel just kind of catty, which is about the last vibe you want for this sound. Now, bizarrely, I will say the greater abrasive elements, that they actually kind of click on songs like Count to 5, but, you know, the further you get into this project, you note the repeated rhymes and the metaphors and the sinking feeling that the writing just is not as interesting or well structured as I'd like it to be. Strong 6 out of 10. Next up, Crooked Shadows by Dashboard Confessional.
And try very hard to know just what to say. Just what to say, just what to say. I try very hard to know just what to say. Just what to say, just what to say.
Alright, we all knew it was a matter of time before Dashboard Confessional put together a comeback to ride the newest emo wave. But here's a question, who was asking for it? As a band, Dashboard Confessional has always been the sort of emo group that I have never really liked. Not as theatrical as the mid-2000s breakthrough bands, not as anthemic as Jimmy Eat World, not as cutting, so to speak, as bands like Say Anything or Brand New. They basically occupied a niche just polished enough to get the mainstream crossover on rock radio, but with nowhere close to the flavor or firepower to really stick out for me. And this being their big comeback? Alright, look, I'm appreciative that Chris Carrabba finally picked up some grit in his voice, but thanks to now being on Fueled by Ramen, it's not like the guitars are allowed to have any real muscle to match the heavier drum lines, and that's before we get to the absolutely awful mixing, which has no clear idea where to place any of the vocal tracks or what elements of gloss best complements any of it. Seriously, the synth touches on this album just do not work at all, should not have been here. Coupled with the rather forgettable lyrics, the only reason this isn't worse is because of the raw sincerity on some of the acoustic ballads, and that can kind of be likable in a clumsy way. And even then, it only barely makes up for the trap-inspired pop songs that show up when you least expect them. In other words, another light 4 out of 10. Next up, the self-titled record from Leaving Thomas.
The end of the line. We all need a happy end, 'cause it's safer not to try. But we both know we said goodbye a million times like this before. But then you're back at my door and we're ready for more, and we don't know why.
Alright, so now we get a mixed-gender Canadian country duo that is playing more towards the mainstream, which is definitely rare enough these days to afford some scrutiny. And honestly, I'm not really won over, and I want it to be. The vocal production and the synth feel really flimsy and don't really flatter lead singer Annika Oligard's rougher vocal tone, and they aren't fooling anybody trying to wedge those blocky drum machines in, especially considering how they have the problem of chopping up many of these grooves into disconnected fragments, which is a damn shame because, yeah, there are some good melodic progressions on songs like Waiting Kinda Girl, and when this record does pivot into more defined country swagger like Blame It on the Neon, it's actually pretty solid. Unfortunately, the songwriting doesn't really take a lot of chances, mostly giving Oligard nearly all the lead vocal duties, and not really taking advantage of the dynamic that you get between the two in the writing or delivery. But then again, most of the writing is pretty by the numbers when it comes to mainstream, relationship-focused and driven country, avoiding many of the cringeworthy cliches and dramatic pitfalls, but not really rising above it either. Overall, yeah, it's passable, but I gotta be honest, it's not all that memorable, and I was really hoping this is gonna be better. So I'm thinking light 6 out of 10. Next up, Toe Tap by Kero Kero Bonito.
Somehow I know that I'll come back. See, I haven't lost sight before.
Okay, I'm not nearly as allergic to this sort of plastic but kind of wonky internet-infused J-pop as some people are. I remember when Mike Seatown had to cover Kero Kero Bonito's debut on Out of My Element, and I totally get why this would just not click for him, especially with the wonky hip-hop elements that are juxtaposed with the indie pop and the chiptune. But at the same time, I was pretty underwhelmed by that debut revisiting it too. Mostly because everything they're doing, Poppy is doing with sharper hooks, more expressive vocals, and a little bit more pathos running through the lyrics. I don't know, with Kero Kero Bonito, I seem to be expecting that pitch black pivot given the desaturated lyrics and vocal delivery, and even if there are some subversive elements lyrically, they don't come through in the instrumentation on that debut at all. But fine, if they're playing it straight beyond just pure catchiness, I just can't help but find them a little uneven overall, except on this EP, they do make that darker pivot. The lyrics are a little bit more cryptic, the synth tones are creepier and more discordant, the grooves are blockier, the guitars are more wiry and discordant around the jaunty hooks. You think there's even pivots to experimental garage or noise rock that would click for them, and yet even with that, it had them feeling of material pivoting towards obvious distorted creepypasta without a real core for the shock. And even then, it doesn't seem like the dark pivot really materializes as this EP rounds out with a dreamy R&B touch indie rock slow burn, of which we've heard dozens of times before. You know what, it's passable, but it's also too abbreviated to really hit it harder as anything more than a diversion, and really, I don't know where the band's gonna go next. 6 out of 10. Next up, Panic Vertigo EP by The Rex. Okay, we got a California indie rock band releasing their second EP and playing more to a pop rock, pop punk sound, and while my first impression is that the Weezer worship is strong with this group, more of the record seems to be gunning for the synth-inflected pop punk tones that are being pushed by Fueled by Ramen just about now, except with blown out fuzzy guitar leads that actively clip the edge of the mix, which is honestly a bit of a shame because the group harmonies and the vocals are pretty solid in a 5 Seconds of Summer vein, and they do know their way around a pretty damn catchy hook and punchy bass line, which actually has some presence. Now, the content isn't much beyond semi-bratty relationship and teenage angst, par for the course in the genre, I get it, and I'm not really hearing what rises above average here beyond just the vocal personality, and man, you could tell which song was co-written with Alex Gaskarth of All Time Low, but beyond that, the production issues keep this from rising above just kinda decent, so, I don't know, 6 out of 10, again. And finally, One Pop by Eric Taxon.
An ocean of pure bubblegum. We both know that the future's all we have. In a land of time, we'll drive through all the motions you're so troubled on. I'll put us on the map.
You know, Eric Taxon has always said that depending on the project, it might not work for you, and while I certainly get the appeal of One Pop, it's not really one that gives me a lot to say about it. Minimalist, textured, plinking keyboard melodies with muffled touches of static or trap skitter forming any sort of beat, and while the progressions might pick up a little bit of wiry density, there is a part of me that misses the more intricate songwriting details and melodic development that characterize records like Paul or The Art State. Now, we do get moments of that. Postmodern Boyfriend is a cute little love song. The desperate earnestness of Golden that might feature some of his cleanest and most anxious vocals to date, a sharp contrast of Guns, which has these more jagged elements and more synthesized vocals, and the more edge that Eric Taxon develops, the more intrigued I am by the song, and I'm not going to deny that the circular synth oscillations of songs like Wall or the more developed melody on Trap, they are pretty damn appealing, but even then, I can't deny that as a whole, I wish there was a little bit more meat on these bones like we got on this last 2 pop records. I still mostly dig it though, and Guns, that's definitely a great track, so I'm thinking a 7 out of 10. Check this out. So yeah, that's what we got today. I know there's a lot of negative reviews, but if you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. And if there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process, link to my Patreon is right over there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher tier contributors, you guys get to add albums, movies, or even a top 10 list to that schedule. Want to see the schedule? It's on my Instagram, link below. But till next time, I'm Mark, you're watching The Trailing Edge on Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.